You need to make sure that the value you promise in sales is the value that you deliver and that you can document that value. Because if you don't do that, you're going to struggle with renewals.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for in eBay.
I mean, it's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Jennings Executive Search. I had a great conversation with John Jennings about the skills needed in different pricing roles. He and I think a lot alike. If you're looking for a new pricing role, or if you're trying to hire just the right pricing person, I strongly suggest you reach out to Jennings Executive Search. They specialize in placing pricing people. Say that 3 times fast. Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the transformative relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving, and our guest today is Stephen Forth. And you know Stephen by now, so I'm not even going to give you 3 things. Other than he's probably now the world's foremost expert on AI and pricing. Although we're not going to talk about AI today unless it happens to come up. Welcome, Stephen.
Great to be talking again, Mark.
Hey, we're going to have a mini argument, I hope, actually. And we're going to talk about value-based pricing and willingness to pay and other topics like that. And it turns out that I wrote a blog probably a couple months ago, and I don't even remember the topic. I probably should have looked at it, but it was something like value-based pricing and willingness to pay were the same thing. And that's how I used to define value-based pricing, is willingness to pay. And a bunch of pricing experts wrote on there, hey, that's not the right definition. And I'm kind of tired of that, but I want to hear from you first before I tell you where I'm heading. Is value-based pricing the same thing as willingness to pay? Are they different? How do you think about those?
So thanks, Mark. And I passionately believe that they are different. And the reason that I believe that is, first, willingness to pay, I think historically has been promoted by the heavy metal pricing software vendors. And we all know who they are, but I'll just name a few of them: Pros and PriceFX, and all of a sudden I'm blanking on the other 2.
Zilliant, Vendavo.
Yes, yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
A senior moment, but I'm embarrassed to have had that scene. But anyway, so those guys, what they do is that they have some fairly sophisticated models that, based on your data, estimate what they think your willingness to pay is. And then they give you a price that is based on that estimated willingness to pay. And basically, they have a black box that comes up with a number, and the salespeople are expected to sell to that number. Now, I think there's a whole list of problems with this. First of all, if I'm a buyer and I say, well, why should I pay that price? You can't very well say, well, our fancy AI said that that's the price you should be willing to pay. As a buyer, I don't care.
Certainly agree with that.
And I don't think any salesperson is dumb enough to say that. But that's sort of the implication. And the second thing is that willingness to pay is, I don't think it's a given. I think it's something that you shape. And in fact, Mark, your books, many of them talk about how you shape willingness to pay. So, there are actions that you can take that change willingness to pay. So my focus is on those actions that you take, as you're setting up the conversation about price, that determine willingness to pay. And if you think of Tom Nagel's, original economic value estimation, EVE models, what they do is they estimate the value that's being provided to your customer, and then you can claim a part of that value. And how much of it you can claim depends on a number of factors, such as your brand strength, such as the risk of actually realizing the value, such as the amount of evidence you have to support your value claims, etc. So that allows you to have a big ability to shape willingness to pay. And so to me, value comes before willingness to pay, and it's one of the things that allows you to shape it. So when you conflate value and willingness to pay, I think you lose the power of value-based pricing and the ability to structure those conversations.
Okay, so I want to start by saying you didn't say anything that I can disagree with. So that annoys me. But we think about this quite differently. Right? And so let's make a conversation about value for a second. And I often teach the difference between perceived value and real value.
Mm-hmm.
And so real value is what I actually got after I bought and used the product. How much value was there? Perceived value is what did I believe before I bought the product?
Mm-hmm.
And as you rightly said, a good salesperson increases perceived value. Right? My job as a salesperson is to communicate the value of my product to you as a customer so that over time you believe more and more and more that I have this value. And so how much are you willing to pay for a product? It has everything to do with how much value you believe you're going to get. And so that's why I conflate these two a lot. Now, on the other hand, I'm going to agree with you in that willingness to pay and value aren't the same thing, because there's a whole other side of pricing that I often make fun of, and that's called behavioral economics. Right? In behavioral economics, I can get you to pay more without changing your value perceptions. Right? Go ahead.
Yeah.
That was
I'm not
face.
sure that I think it probably does a lot of the behavioral economics tricks. I think do lead to a change in the value perception, like the anchoring. And I also want to say that I think that kind of behavioral economics gives us people in pricing a bad name. And inflating the perception of value also gives us a bad name, at least with customer success. So if a salesperson,
so inflating it beyond reality, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But if I tell you, hey, I just built this new software package, how much are you willing to pay for me? Your first question is, well, what does it do?
Mm-hmm.
Your value is zero.
Yeah.
And then as I start to explain and give you information, you start increasing your perception of the value of the product.
Yeah.
Now, if I inflate that too high, if I lie, then you're totally right.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're in alignment here. But so coming back to just briefly on behavioral pricing, I think many of the sort of fundamental principles of behavioral pricing, a lot of which I think come from Tversky and Cunahan's work about anchoring effects and the fact that many people, I do not believe it's all people, but many people are willing to pay more to avoid a risk than they are to get a gain. Fundamental prospect theory.
So if you just take that one argument, right, prospect theory and losses loom larger than gains, simply the way I describe something to you. In fact, I often teach this, right? So we'll talk about good, better, best for a second, right? We see good, better, best on websites, and it always goes left to right, good, then better, then best. When I teach salespeople, I say you need to present best, better, good. Now, why do we do that? Because when you start with best and you move to better, you've taken away features. So now the loss is there. I've lost features and I've gained something in price. But because losses loom larger than gains, then the best looks better, right? And so that simple trick is behavioral economics, has nothing to do with value.
Okay, but it does have but anchoring. Yeah, I think we're starting to argue choices of words here, but that's I wouldn't even call it a trick, because that's setting up the frame for how people are going to perceive value, and that impacts willingness to pay, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
So can I, by the way, this is the very first time I've said these words publicly, but I want to present to you and hear your opinion on what I think is the ultimate pricing strategy.
Mhm.
And I've spent time figuring this out or thinking a lot about it. And it's the name I want to give it is context-driven pricing.
Mhm.
Context-driven pricing is defined as charge what a customer is willing to pay. And willingness to pay there's three core tenets to this, right? One tenet is willingness to pay is context dependent.
Mhm.
The second one is willingness to pay is malleable. So we have the ability to influence it. And the third one is there are always constraints.
Mhm. So
Right?
say a bit more about the constraints.
So the easiest constraint to understand is there's no way I can read your mind to know how much you're willing to pay. And so I can never charge exactly that price. That's the easiest one to understand. But you might think of constraints as, hey, I'm selling something on retail shelf and there's no way I can charge a different price to every customer. So that's a constraint I'm dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
You might say, I've got a Vendavo pricing system and it doesn't allow me to do price segmentation in this way. So that's a constraint that I have.
That's actually a reason to replace the pricing system.
Yeah, well, to a point, yes.
The first one is a real constraint. The second one is a constraint that you've imposed on yourself.
Yeah, totally with you. But as we start thinking through how do I want to do pricing, my view of it is let's think through what's optimal pricing and then which constraints are we going to try to knock down,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I can't put a different price for each product and each situation for each customer.
So, well, actually, I'm going to challenge that last one. And we said we weren't going to talk about AI.
But
as you know, I'm working on something that I call generative pricing, which is an approach to pricing that is designed to be applicable to generative AI-based applications. And I actually think, Mark, that there are a lot of connection points between what I'm calling generative pricing and what you're calling context-based pricing. And what generative AI does is that it allows your configuration, so how your offer is configured, to change dynamically based on the buyer's context. And that's why the conventional approaches to pricing, whether it be traditional value-based pricing or dynamic pricing or cost-based pricing or whatever other based version you want to use, are not adequate to a world in which you can rapidly adjust to the buyer's context. So that's the core idea behind generative pricing. And I think there might be some connection points to what you're saying.
I think absolutely. I had a Barrett Thompson of Zilliant was on the podcast. It came out this week, but we recorded it a month or so ago. And one of the things that was fascinating, we talked a little bit about AI, and you've probably told me this, but it didn't sink in well enough. But he was talking about how we could use AI to estimate how much value a customer is getting from our product. Right. And so I think this is brilliant. Right.
Yeah.
And so whether we talk about context as in AI now knows it's raining, so my umbrella is going to be more expensive. I'm okay with that too. But I just find that whole concept of using AI to figure out what's the willingness to pay. I'm totally okay with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Although again, I think that it's I think that one needs to have a value model in order to make these things work. And that's another reason that I'm pushing back against willingness to pay equals value, because a lot of the willingness to pay estimation is based on black box estimations, such as the ones that Zilliant and Vendavo and Pros and PriceFX and so on do, which have their intellectual roots in revenue management for airlines, I think, is where a lot of this stuff originally came from.
Yep.
I think that does not give you the framework that you need to think about value so that you can provide guidance, not just to sales, but also to product development. So, I mean, if I tell, my product development team, develop a product for which there will be higher willingness to pay, sort of we're not giving them any levers to pull or anything to act on.
Yep.
Whereas if I say, here's the value model for how we're creating value for our customers, and we have these 5 value drivers, and I want you to, and it's based on these 3 performance improvement claims. How can you improve the performance improvement claims so that it'll flow through to the value drivers? Or how can you increase the value drivers? Or in some cases, is there a new value driver that we can add? Can you innovate to find a new value driver?
Yep.
So to me, that's a richer framework within which to act.
By the way, I agree 100%. And when I think about, so in my mind, I'm now putting willingness to pay at the highest level. And so when I think about willingness to pay, what's that consist of? Well, I think it consists of value and psychological behaviors of buyers, right? And so there may be more, but those are the 2 I could think of off the top of my head. And so everything I do and everything I focus on is on the value side.
Yeah.
Right. I want to know where value is coming from, how customers perceive value. How do we deliver incremental profit to our customers? Right. That's value. But in the end, it's willingness to pay that I want to price for.
Okay. We're not being very successful here, Mark, in disagreeing.
Okay, darn it.
But, no, I agree. You need to get to a number that a buyer will buy. And but I would suggest that the way you get there is by, first of all, being able to understand and communicate value.
Yep.
And then, yes, there are ways to frame that value. And some of those come from behavioral economics, and other parts of psychology. I think a lot of stuff that gets lumped into behavioral economics that was already well known to as far back as B.F. Skinner.
Yeah.
But that's okay. Everyone has to have their own thing that they promote. But to me, that you thinking about these 2 things quasi-independently allows you to think more clearly. So thinking first about value, and then how you use your understanding of value to shape willingness to pay. And as you said, it's not the only way you shape willingness to pay, but it's a very important part of it.
It absolutely is. I think the other thing that I like about the concept of context-driven value or context-driven pricing is that value is truly different for every single customer. And so we talk about value models, but value models can be very different depending on what the market segment is I'm talking to.
Yeah.
Or it could be very different depending on the situation that buyer is in.
Yeah.
And
so I would go even further than you said. It's not only is it different, very different for each customer, it's different for each customer at different points in time.
Yep.
And generative AI, forgive me, is going to enable us to build applications that are much more dynamically configurable, so that they can real-time configure themselves for the buyer's context and then update that context as it changes.
Okay, so it's sad that we can't disagree, Stephen.
I will find something.
We're only 18 minutes in. Let's let the listeners have a break, and we'll pick up a new topic next time.
Okay. But yeah, so I just want to sort of underline, though, that willingness to pay is an outcome that you shape. It's not something that is given to you by something outside of your product and how you sell it, and that you play a huge role in defining the context.
I couldn't agree more. My third book, Selling Value, is all about that, right? How do we shape someone's willingness to pay by communicating the value of what we deliver to the customer? Good. So, and I'm sure behavioral economics folks would say the same thing, right? Not about value, but they would say that, hey, we can shape willingness to pay. In fact, all their studies are about how do I get people to pay more money?
Yeah, and which I think we have to be careful. We want people to pay a fair amount of money. If I can get people to, if I can trick someone into paying more than something's valuable, greater than its actual value, and value in this case means the economic return they're going to get, I don't think I've done myself a service in the long term.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. If you think about your own lifetime value, if you're cheating customers, you will not last in the long run.
Yeah.
Right. And so we have to be fair to our customers. We have to deliver way more value than we're capturing. But I got to say, I think most companies have the problem that they don't know how to capture their fair share of the value they deliver. So
I definitely think that's true in B2B, and it's just getting worse. It's you would think that after all these years we would be getting better at it, but I think that technology is changing so fast right now. We're getting worse, not better.
Yeah. Hey, let me toss out one more thought. In the world of B2C, or even in the world of Vendavo pricing, or Zilliant or Pros pricing, the prices they put out, you and I would say, hey, you didn't do a value model, right? You don't know where the value comes from. But one could still argue that they're testing to see where value is, but they don't really know why it's there.
I think they're testing to see where willingness to pay is.
Yes.
And where willingness to pay is without the tools that we've discussed to shape willingness to pay. So, if I don't shape willingness to pay, I just accept the buyer's perception. That's what the current generation, or maybe it's not even the current, that's what the original price management software and revenue management software did. I'm delighted that Barrett is talking about using AI to estimate and understand value, and I would love to know what Zilliant is actually doing on that. But I still don't see how you do this without a value model. So, when I think about what I do, I would call it model-driven pricing. And what we need to do is to have more flexible and adaptive models for the reasons that you identified, right? Is that value is context dependent. And that context changes over time. Sometimes changes very quickly over time.
It's really interesting. So let's go back to the original pricing work, and we have price elasticities, right? And so that's definitely not value-based pricing, but it is trying to get at it isn't even trying to get at where's the most value. It's just trying to get at where's the optimal spot on the demand curve.
Yeah, and basically it comes from economic theory. I think that the podcast you did with Tom Nagel does a great job of explaining this. And Tom's first huge insight was that in B2B, price elasticity curves don't really exist. So to say to someone, well, you should price based on the price elasticity of demand is a meaningless statement.
Yes.
And what Tom did was come up with an alternate way to think about the problem. And that's where economic value estimation comes from. And basically, when I say value model, I'm really thinking about what Tom did. So our value models at Ibbaka are based on Tom's work on EVE and economic value estimation. And
yep. Awesome. Stephen, let's go ahead and wrap this thing up. Let's ask the final question anyway. What's your one big of pricing advice this week that you could give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
That you need to make sure that the value you promise in sales is the value that you deliver, and that you can document that value. Because if you don't do that, you're going to struggle with renewals.
So I'm going to pile on for just a second. I think you're the one who convinced me that documenting value was so important, and I've started teaching that. So I think of three types of value now. I think of perceived value. Let's talk about a subscription, right? I think of perceived value, I think of real value, and then I think of proven value, right? Have you actually proven that they get this? And if you can prove it, then you don't get the churn. But if you haven't proven it, you're susceptible.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I thank you for that one. Stephen, thanks so much for your time today. If anybody wants to contact you, how can they do that?
The best way is to link to me on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find, Stephen Forth, or you can email me, Stephen, Steven, at Ibbaka.com.
All right. Thank you. And to our listeners, thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this, would you please leave us a rating and a review? And finally, if you have any questions or comments about this podcast or pricing, feel free to email me, mark@impactpricing.com. Now, go make an impact. Thanks again to Jennings Executive Search for sponsoring our podcast. If you're looking to hire someone in pricing, I suggest you contact someone who knows pricing people. Contact Jennings Executive Search.